Alright guys, welcome back to the Dog Pound, and today we are doing a meta-analysis of the latest patch that just comes out today, or getting released tomorrow actually, March 4th, but the announcement came out today with the balance changes that are going to be put into effect a week before the Breakthrough mini expansion hits, called Breakthrough Catalyst, hitting next week in about 8 days. And so today they just announced the fact that the cards are done and ready, and so they're releasing them prior to the expansion. And so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to take a look at these changes and see what impact they might have the meta. At a high level, it looks pretty underwhelming in terms of impacting the meta that most of the player base is actually concerned about right now. The feedback that is being given regarding what people would like to see adjusted, that doesn't really touch any of those things. So it does leave a bit to the imagination, wondering if Breakthrough Catalyst that comes out in a week's time will actually have brand new cards to help address what is going on in the meta today. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in and look at the changes that were announced today. Alright, so the first card on the chopping block is the P-51 Mustang. Shortly after just get to be able to deal 5 damage to a random air unit, it now gets nerfed down to only be able to deal 4 damage to a random air unit. This is a pretty significant change. I'm not gonna argue that the card probably was a little bit stronger than it should be, and I don't think that's a function of the stats or the ability, which I guess in reality it really is. But the fact that it's a limited card, with the power that it had, it was a bit strong. So the question that I raise here is whether or not this nerf was the right way to nerf the card. The whole idea of buffing the card to deal 5 damage to a random air unit was to actually make the card playable. Before that, it wasn't even playable. It was not effective at all, couldn't be used anywhere. And that buff to dealing 5 damage to a random air unit as part of the starter card set for a brand new player was actually very, very strong and quite nice to have for new players to be able to incorporate that into their starter decks. And now looking at where the meta went, the card became meta basically. So in order to deal with a lot of the air units that play out on the board. But now being nerfed down to only dealing 4 damage to a random enemy, this plane now has 18 new air units in the game that it cannot deal with. Not that there's 18 new air units, but out of all the air units in the game, there's now 18 added to the list of enemy air units that this unit cannot destroy. And when you look at other cards in the game, such as the Avenger, 8-cost unit, a 4/4 bomber, destroys any unit on the board randomly that has higher than 5 health. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a 9-cost 5/5 bomber with heavy armor that destroys any unit on the board randomly. The Death from Above on a stick, effectively destroying any unit. This plane, as the P-51 Mustang, stat-wise, deployment, and effect-wise, is completely in line with those cards. So why not just increase the cost of the Mustang? I think making the Mustang a 7-cost plane instead of a 6-cost plane might have been a better nerf. Maybe. The other effect, the factor is that it's a limited card, meaning you can have 3 of these in your deck. The Avenger, the B-17, they're specials, so you're only going to have 2 in your deck of each. So maybe making the P-51 a special instead of a limited. They've made changes in the past like that, where they change the rarity of a card. I guess we don't see those types of changes really anymore since the full release. Maybe that was more of a beta thing that they did, but we have seen that in the past. So I think that now, given the fact that the P-51 Mustang only deals 4 damage to a random enemy air unit, really makes it a lot less playable for the 6 cost. Still has value against certain air, Brit Air, for example. I think it makes it more of a bit of a mid-range card, mid to early range card versus the sort of tempo control card later in the game that it would have been, as it was with the 5 damage to a random enemy unit. I mean, when we factor in the key air that this plane can no longer kill, we're looking at the FW-190, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Yak-9, the Spitfire MK, the 5-cost one, the RAF Lightning, the Key 84 Frank, the Key 83, the P-38 Lightning, the Henkel HE-219 that just got buffed to cost 4 only instead of 5, and the B-25 Mitchell. All these cards are somewhere in realms of the meta. Maybe not the top meta, but up in that upper echelon, and now the P-51 Mustang cannot deal with them. And what that means is you're only dealing 4 damage, which means you still need a trade operation to happen in order to handle the unit. So now you're only dealing 4 damage to that B-17 instead of flat out killing it, which means now you're hoping that your opponent is going to use their 3 credit operation on that B-17 to kill your Mustang. Or maybe they have their own Mustang and now they're able to actually kill your Mustang still, because Mustang versus Mustang, they can kill each other with the deployment effect. So they can now deploy a Mustang to kill your Mustang and still have their B-17 and all these other aircraft still alive on the board with 1 health left over. So this is a pretty significant nerf to the P-51 Mustang. I think I would like to see it handled differently. I think it would be, hopefully, would have been better to see handled as changing maybe to a special, or just increasing the cost to 7 or 8, so that the value would be in line with some of these other aircraft that have pretty significant removal deployment effects. But that being said, we don't know what's to come in Breakthrough Catalyst, which is really going to be the whole theme of this update, because these changes that we're going to see in this patch are so interesting to me that it makes me really wonder if Catalyst is really what's going to help shake up the meta and deal with things. So that's the P-51 Mustang. Moving on, the next card that got nerfed, the 75th Rangers. Brand new card that came out in Breakthrough. Very powerful card. Not in all of the meta decks, not really in a lot of the decks that you see. Definitely super strong in draft. Maybe that's the area where the card is made to be having more of an effect with this nerf than in constructed. But the deployment effect of reducing a unit to 0 operation cost is pretty significant. And I think lowering this guy's health down to a 4-6, a 6 HP is a pretty good nerf. I think that brings it down into being more manageable, considering that on curve, you're basically putting this on the board, giving another substantial size unit. Could be an Air Cobra, could be P-40, could be Sherman, these types of things, giving them a 0 operation cost so that you could deploy this huge 4-8 unit and then attack with that other unit at 0 operation cost. So bringing this down to a 6 health is probably a step in the right direction. Again, you might compare this card to other cards like the C4th Highlander, I think is one that it often gets compared to, because when you're looking at it from a defensive perspective, with its 4 attack having a 4-8 health, recently getting nerfed to be a 4-7. You look at that card. That card's, again, it's a special, so you're only going to have 2 of those in your deck, whereas the 75th Rangers has a standard card. I think was well overdue. I think we were calling nerf on this one when it first got released. Being a standard and having 4 of these in your deck could be quite strong. So I'm pretty happy to see this change. I think that'll be well received, and I think especially in draft, really takes a lot of the potency out of it to balance out the draft game a little bit more. In constructed, maybe we'll start to see it a bit more. I don't know, like usually nerfing a card doesn't increase the chance of seeing it in constructed more. Don't really see this one in constructed a whole lot right now. It's not playing in the meta, maybe playing down in the lower ranks because it was quite a strong card, but right now not in the top tiers, and this won't help it get into the top tiers, but I think definitely balances out the draft game a bit, which is something they do incorporate when doing these balance changes. So that's it for 75th Rangers. Not a lot to say there. -2 health, and we'll see how that plays out for that card. Next, we are looking at it once again, the Flammpanzer. Flammpanzer, as we know, staple snap pick in Germany at one point in time, and then it got nerfed to not be able to touch air units on its deployment effect. And that caused a bit of an uproar in the community. It really made Brit Air that much stronger, having one less removal tool to deal with those early aircraft that get close air support. Well, the Flammpanzer is back. Now it can deal with air units again. So we've retraced back and took away the nerf that happened before, but as a trade-off for that, it now only has 3 health. This is more significant than you might think. Only having 3 health pulls it from that 4 to 3, really puts it in range of a lot of removal, and I think that that makes this card a little bit expensive when you factor in the removal effect. What it turns into is basically you have a 3 cost tank that puts a 3/3 unit on the board, and it will destroy a 1-cost unit. It helps get rid of those pesky smokescreen, the Pioneer, the Jaskos, the Airborns that have mobilized, and now, of course, back to being able to deal with Swordfish and Gladiator and other 1-cost units. The artilleries, right? The 1-1 anti-aircraft artillery, for example, killing that off as well. And none of that's changed other than now the aircraft are back in the picture. But at 3 health, what they've effectively done is said, okay, we're going to let the Flammpanzer take out that aircraft, but we're going to reduce it down to 3 health. The more common Brit Air scenario that we see is British Japan. We do see British US a bit, but more common is British Japan Air. And with that, you get air superiority. So now what we're saying is, with your Flammpanzer, you can deploy it, kill the plane, but now the opponent can play a plane. If they have another aircraft on the board, they can play air superiority and kill your Flammpanzer. So gives more of a fair, even trade that way. You kill their plane, they have a mechanism to deal with. And not to mention that Empire Strikes is now in closer range. With 2 bombers, Empire Strikes will wipe out the Flammpanzer instead of needing 3 bombers to wipe out the 4 health. But further to that, looking beyond Brit Air and looking at the whole realm of removal cards in the game, Flammpanzer now dies to a Careless Talk. It used to be a nice way to play around Careless Talk. No more, it dies. You still get your deployment effect, but you're going to die. Air defense, if you're attacking the HQ, for example, and not taking damage back from a unit, Flammpanzer dies. It can't take on an air defense. From the people, deal 3 damage to your unit, dead. Bombing raid, 3 damage to the unit in the middle, dead. Gunboat raid, when the unit's in the front line, dead. B-25 Mitchell deployment effect, deal 3 damage to a random enemy, dead. Mosquito FBMK, the 6-cost Mosquito for Britain, deal 3 damage to an enemy unit, Flammpanzer dead. Carpet bombing, strategic bombing, all deal 3 damage, Flammpanzer is now dead. The anti-tank artillery is in range. PaK-38, the 45 anti-tank gun, that is what we see now in the Soviet artillery meta. The Westby, and obviously any other units that have a 3 attack, but those specific ones are very cheap artillery that we see in early game that can now wipe out the Flammpanzer. So you can play out your Flammpanzer, deal the deployment destruction to the 1-1 anti-aircraft artillery, but then in exchange, the anti-tank gun is going to be able to kill it. So you don't get that extra staying power that you normally would have had with the Flammpanzer. So quite a significant trade-off now with the Flammpanzer. In terms of what it can do, we could kill an air unit now. That's great news, but keep in mind that the ability to kill this thing now with all of these other options are now available, and that does make it a lot weaker of a unit in terms of its staying power on the board and being able to take advantage of the stats, especially at a 2 operation cost with the 3 stats. And not to mention the trading value obviously has gone down quite significantly. You're looking at a lot of cheaper units now that only have 3 attack trading off your Flammpanzer. You don't survive the attack. So keep that in mind when you're evaluating the use of this card. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I think it'll still be effectively a snap include in most decks. I think he still is played quite a bit because the deployment effect is quite strong. It is one of the only ways, one of the few ways, I'll say, to deal with 1-cost smokescreen units, and I think that is still what the main value of the Flammpanzer is, but it does take a bit of punch out of the British Air deck now that we can go after those air units again. So that's my summary of the Flammpanzer. It's a neutralizing change in a sense. They've buffed it back to kill the air units, but then they nerf the health. So in my mind, it's not really a buff or a nerf. They neutralize each other. There's a lot of pros and cons to the card based on this change. The next card that we see get changed is in the Navy. So in the Navy is a countermeasure that when you get attacked, the unit that gets attacked would get a +2/+2. It costs 2 credits to use this countermeasure. So what they've done is they said, okay, well, this card was a bit underwhelming, so let's buff it and make it only cost 1. But for some reason at the same time, they go and change the effects that it has. So now in the Navy, only costs 1 to use it, but when the enemy attacks, you give your unit only a +1/+2. So that sounds like a nerf. So once again, the card is neutralized in terms of being a buff or a nerf. Will it get played more often? Curious to see myself. I don't know. I have not seen this card a lot. I have seen it more recently in random decks and opponents on ladder, but in general, it's not a super popular card in terms of USA countermeasures. I think with the introduction of some of the other breakthrough countermeasures, this card has sort of fallen to the side. When you look at Sniped, for example, it could be a lot more effective as a countermeasure, and putting a in the Navy as a special 2 copies into your deck. That's 2 cards out of your whole deck. What kind of value are you going to get on this? Could be useful. I look at, when I look at in the Navy, these kinds of buffs, I love applying these things to things like artillery, fighters, bombers, those kinds of things that are really potent on the board and have a lot of power and a lot of speed to the game when your opponent wants to get rid of them because they're such magnets for getting killed as quickly as possible. This is a nice way to sort of mess over your opponent and where they lose the trade potentially, but also buff your unit at the same time. Keeping in mind that you still receive the damage, so that +2 has to be enough for you to survive the attack. But we'll see what happens with that card. I think in terms of a change, it's neither here or there, in my opinion. It's quite a mediocre change to a mediocre card because in lowering the cost and lowering the stats that you get, they kind of wash each other out, in my opinion. Why not leave it as a +2/+2? I mean, when you look at the power that counteroffensive has as a +2/+2, maybe they reduced it because of a lesson learned from counteroffensive, but where this is only going to really do a +1, not a compounded by damaged units like counteroffensive does. It makes me wonder. In any case, I leave that one with you to evaluate. I don't think this card is going to see a lot more action, but we'll see what happens. Obviously, whenever these patches happen, cards get played more often in the beginning until people realize that the change actually didn't change anything, and then they fall back to the side. So we'll probably see a little spike in use early on, but then eventually we will see it fall back to the next card that changes. All right, this is an interesting one. So a lot of complaints about discard and draw denial meta right now. So we see that archetype being affected. This is Lurking Danger and used to draw a random countermeasure from your deck and it would cost 3 less. So what would this do? If you had this in your hand after Mulligan, but you never found your Careless Talk, throw up a Lurking Danger and you would get a 0 cost countermeasure most likely into your hand to use on turn 1. Not all countermeasures want to be used on turn 1. You're not necessarily going to drop from the deep on turn 1 and waste that on a 1 credit unit, but you definitely would want to use your Careless Talks in those cases if you're running those in your deck so that you can get those off at 0 cost. So what they've said is, we're not going to let this go at a 0 cost. The credit discount was not that good in their opinion, and so what they've done is they changed it so that you draw 2 random countermeasures from your deck. So this is an elite card. It costs 1 credit and it gives you a 2 draw power. Draw power in this game is huge, and I think drawing 2 random countermeasures from your deck, considering you're only going to use this card in a deck that is archetype around discard and draw denial, this is a super powerful card still. It's an elite. You only have 1 in your deck, but the ability to pull out 2 countermeasures, you don't get a discount on their cost, but you do guarantee that you're drawing 2 countermeasures out of your deck, which is primarily the majority of your deck, right? You've got the draw denial cards and the Panthers and whatnot, and the Wolf Packs and things like that that are orders, but you do have a good number of countermeasures in your deck, and being able to pull out 2 of them for 1 credit is pretty friggin' amazing. I would put this on the same level as like a Rising Sun level of draw power, which is arguably one of the best draw cards in the game, and I think that now Lurking Danger is actually an amazing card. It was a snap include in the meta anyway, but now I think this just makes it even stronger. It doesn't give you that 0 cost ability, but you're basically going to get you're basically going to get your 2 countermeasures into your hand to use on your opponent nonetheless. So I think it's a better card like this than it was before. And I'm not going to pronounce this right because how could I? I'm not Russian. And this is the Soviet
Shturmovik
II-2M. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it is, as you see here in the picture, the 4-3 bomber with heavy armor. We've seen them doing this in the past couple of patches where they're looking at some of these big bombers that cost quite a bit and don't get played a lot because of their heavy cost, and they give us a little buff and bring it down to a 4 cost. And so in this case, that's the only change to the card, so it's just a straight up buff, will reducing the cost to 4 make this card more playable. On the draft side of things, I think that this is a substantial change. I think that this becomes more of an easy include in draft. To have a 4-3 bomber on curve at turn 4 with heavy armor is pretty substantial and hard to deal with from a draft perspective. Really, your opponent needs some pretty specific cards to be able to get rid of this. And with the 4 attack, it's pretty strong. So I think in terms of constructed, I don't think this bomber is going to find a home in constructed at this stage. It's kind of clunky still, I think, from that perspective as a standard card. But I think in draft, this is a pretty significant change. And we'll see what happens in constructed. I mean, a 4-cost 4-3 bomber is still pretty strong. I think for any bomber, when you evaluate it, if its deployment cost is equal to its attack stat, that is pretty good. Because generally, if you look at bombers, there's quite a gap between the deployment cost and their stats. And so when you see a bomber like this, and it costs 4 to deploy, and it has 4-3 stats with heavy armor, that's a pretty solid plane. So it just might be that it gets to see some action on a Soviet meta level. But remember, right now, the Soviet meta is all around artillery. So how does this fit into that? I don't know. The petty is in, we got the petty in the Soviet artillery deck to block deployment effects and things like that. So I don't know if this plane is actually going to find itself in the meta unless somebody out there is going to create a brand new deck around this sort of bomber that will let a deck come up to be meta with this card. As a standard bomber, though, lower level players, this is a substantially strong card. And when you're not building meta decks and you're just trying to build the best value decks you can as a new player in the game, this card is definitely online for being included as a snap in your Soviet deck if you're able to get your hands on this card. All right, so the next one is an interesting card, Shibata Regiment. In general, historically, if you ask anybody, this card is complete trash. Never gets played, never gets used, and for a good reason. It destroys itself. So unless you get a good buff on this thing, it really is kind of a useless card because it will kill itself. I've used it in draft before, and so what it does is it's a 2-1 with blitz. On turn 3, which is where you really want to use it, you blitz it out to the front line, and at the start of your turn, it gets a +3 attack, but it deals 1 damage to it. So you only really get 1 turn of usage with it until it dies. So it's kind of hard to get value out of it from that perspective, but if what I found in draft mode was that if you do have these in your deck and you get them on curve early in the game, or if you can get them on a situation within the game where you can blitz them out to the front line, then you really kind of force your opponent to have to deal with it. And it's a card that would die anyway, so it just forces a trade, really, in my opinion. And if you can hit face with a +3, that's a 4 attack, which is pretty substantial. So you do get a big attack stat at the cost of the fact that the card's going to die anyway. So they've buff this card, and they've buffed it by changing it to a 1 operation cost, or 1 deployment cost rather. So it only costs 1 to deploy. So now it's a turn 2 play. This is not going to see a life in constructed. The reality is no one's going to include this card in constructed. When you look at the 1-drops that are available for Japan playing aggro, this is not the card you're going to use. You've got your draw engine card, and you've got 34th Infantry, you've got the 15th Cavalry Regiment, you've got all these other cards, 1-drops that just are way better value than what this card offers. So that's the balance patch. That's our March 2021 meta report balance patch. And in general, does this affect the meta a whole heck of a lot? No, we're still going to see artillery all day and all night. We're still going to see discard control all day and all night. And that's just the reality of it. Counteroffensive, we're still going to see it all day and all night. Nothing's changed in that regard. So all we can do is cross our fingers and hope that they didn't adjust those cards at this point in time, because the Breakthrough Catalyst expansion is going to take care of it for us and help generate a whole new exciting meta for us to all go out and experiment with new decks and play the game in a refreshed view of the game and a refreshed view of the meta. So that's all for now, guys. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one.